Any premier who calls a snap election like this is in the middle of the winter is hoping that people aren't paying attention.
Winter elections. They're rare, they're cold, and honestly they make campaigning quite miserable. In fact, in Ontario, our last winter general election was in 1981, over 40 years ago. And yet the province is heading into its next winter election. Why is that?
I don't think we've seen an election in Ontario where every vote counts quite as much as the vote that Ontarians cast today.
What's the argument for why an election should happen right now?
CBC News has learned that Premier Doug Ford is planning to call an election next Wednesday.
Well, it's now confirmed Ontarians will be heading to the polls more than a year ahead of schedule.
What has made these type of elections so rare is that typically in Ontario we have elections every 4 years. This 4-year cycle was formally implemented in the Legislative Assembly Act. It was amended in 1990 to set regular dates in which we can expect our elections to happen. So for the purpose of this video, I actually printed the Elections Act so we can go through it. It lays out everything, who can vote, how votes are counted, and yes, even the rule about having elections every 4 years. So if we refer to this section this subsection right here, it says subject to the powers of the Lieutenant Governor referred to in subsection 1, general elections shall be held the first Thursday in June in the 4th calendar year following polling day in the most recent general election. And seems pretty straightforward, seems pretty simple, but actually we need to look deeper into subsection 1, which is the one right above. This refers to the power of the Lieutenant Governor, or the powers of the Lieutenant Governor. Nothing in this section affects the powers of the Lieutenant Governor, including the power to dissolve the legislature by proclamation in Her Majesty's name when the Lieutenant Governor sees fit.
It's the ritual performed by every Ontario Premier who's ever called an election. The walk to the Lieutenant Governor. Doug Ford did not have to trigger this election. His current mandate lasts until June next year.
The Lieutenant Governor still has the power to dissolve the legislature and call an election prior to that 4-year cycle. And that's how we get our snap elections, which is basically an election that's just called earlier than expected. And in Ontario, that happens in 2 ways. The Premier can simply ask for one, or the minority government in power can fail to pass something major like a budget, and then that triggers an election. Ontario has had 6 notable snap elections, but none of them are more infamous than the one in 1990. In 1987, David Peterson and the Liberals scored a huge majority, but instead of waiting until 1991, he called an election in 1990, thinking he'd cruise to another victory, and that ended up being a severe miscalculation. The economy was a mess, unemployment was sky high, and voters were mad. Enter Bob Rae and the NDP, who surged to an upset victory. This served as a valuable lesson in politics that election results are not predetermined. The voters are real people with real struggles, and ultimately, those people that choose to go to the ballot box hold the power to make real change. So why would Doug Ford call an election in the middle of winter? I think by now it's become obvious that there are 2 driving forces here. One of them being the polls. Doug Ford is up 24 points against the rest of the field in a survey conducted by Leger in which they polled Ontarians in mid-January. The other factor is Donald Trump's election.
We don't need anything, so why are we losing $200 billion a year and more to protect Canada? And I said that to, as I called him, Governor Trudeau.
We'll turn now to Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Thank you so much for joining me here, sir.
Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, Canada.
We need a mandate from the people to fight against Donald Trump's tariffs, the attack he's coming against our families, our businesses, our communities.
Doug Ford has positioned himself as the opposition to Donald Trump. As the federal government was still trying to craft a response to Donald Trump's comments about Canada being the 51st state, Doug Ford had already made multiple appearances on US cable television as Canada's de facto spokesperson. And if we are to consider Mars Styles' comments, which is basically an assumption that the bad weather is going to lead to less people going to the polls, and ironically, as I'm filming this, Toronto is going through a snowstorm. So you add that in with the fact that people are busy with life, school, work, kids. Those are all factors that do impact how politically engaged a person can be during an election. So Doug Ford's call for an election is definitely a political one. Marcel's comments in response to that is also a political one. The only thing that's not political is your vote. That's a personal choice. Elections, no matter the season, are about your future, your community, and ultimately how you want Ontarians to look for the next 4 years. That's if we do make it through the whole 4 years and we don't have another snap election. But regardless, don't let the weather be the reason to not be politically engaged.